The scrap siding smelled of cinder and old oil, and the last light of a September afternoon turned the junk piles the color of dried blood. Broken rail, bent spikes in a rotting barrel, telegraph wire tangled like dead brush. At the far end, half hidden behind warped ties, a rusted iron cylinder lay open at both ends, black with scale, large enough to swallow a man standing. A figure moved along its curve, one hand pressed flat against the metal, the way a person touches something they are deciding to trust with everything they have. Behind him, on a broken handcart, the sum of a family's possessions measured shorter than a coffin lid. September 29, 1880. The Northern Pacific grading camp west of Jamestown sat on scraped earth that smelled of horse manure, coal smoke, and turned clay. Emrys Pritchard stood outside the company tent with his wife beside him and 3 children pressed against her skirt, and he listened to a paymaster's clerk read numbers from a ledger that made his 48 hours sound like a gift. The clerk said Emrys owed for flour, he owed for beans, he owed for lamp oil, and for the canvas over his family's heads. The total came to more than Emrys had earned in his last 3 weeks of grading because the injury, a cracked rib from a dropped rail, had slowed him past usefulness. The camp foreman, Darius Bell, stood 6 paces behind the clerk, with his arms folded and his hat pulled low against the wind. Bell was not a cruel man in his own estimation. He ran a grading camp, not a charity ward. He had said as much that morning. Winter would not wait for lame men and crying children. Emrys had $3.80 folded inside a square of oilcloth in his coat pocket. He had a bent handsaw with 2 teeth missing near the heel. He had a tack hammer, a broken draw knife, 1 wool blanket gone thin at the center, 1 patched quilt, and a handcart with a missing iron tire that pulled to the left on flat ground and would not roll straight on a slope. He had a wife named Martha, who was 33 years old and still shaking from a fever that had kept her flat for 9 days. He had a daughter named Gwen, who was 10, and watched everything without speaking. He had a son named Tomos, who was 7, and kept asking whether they were going to ride the train. He had a daughter named Nell, who was 4, and gripped a cracked tin cup as though someone might take it from her. He did not have a destination. Martha's nearest cousin lived in St. Paul. Rail fare for 5 people was not a number worth calculating when $3.80 was the whole of the account. Walking east meant open prairie, no shelter, and a woman still too weak to carry her own weight for a full day. Walking west meant more open prairie and fewer towns. The grading camp was the farthest settlement Emrys could see in any direction, and the grading camp had just told him to leave. Bell walked over after the clerk finished. He did not look at Martha. He looked at Emrys's hands, which were thick and scarred and cracked across both palms from years of forge work and boiler patching before the railroad hired him for grading. Bell said he would give Emrys until sundown on the 1st of October, 2 days. After that, the tent belonged to the company, the ground belonged to the company, and any man still standing on it without a work chit was trespassing. Emrys asked about the blanket. Bell said the blanket was personal property. Emrys asked about the quilt. Bell said the quilt was personal property. Emrys asked about the cracked sheet iron camp heater that smoked through every seam and barely warmed a space wider than a man's reach. Bell said the heater belonged to the company, but that nobody in camp wanted a broken stove, so Emrys could drag it along if he wanted to haul junk. That was the extent of the negotiation. Martha said nothing during any of it. She held Nell against her hip and breathed through her mouth because her chest still rattled when she inhaled through her nose. Gwen stood close enough to touch her mother's elbow. Tomos had stopped asking about the train. The wind came from the northwest and carried the smell of frost on dirt. September on the northern plains did not warn gently. It warned once, and then it stopped warning. The first man to tell Emrys Pritchard what he already knew arrived on a bay horse before the tent was down. Alva Rusk was 59 years old, a former Army teamster who had freighted supplies across Nebraska and into Dakota Territory before filing his own claim 7 miles south of the rail line. He had wintered on the plains 4 times. He had buried a neighbor's child in January of '79 when the family's soddy roof collapsed under wet snow. He did not introduce himself with any of this. He pulled his horse alongside the Pritchard's pile of belongings and looked at it the way a man looks at a hand of cards that cannot win. Rusk dismounted. He walked around the pile. He counted without being asked. 1.5 sacks of flour, 9 pounds of dried beans in a canvas bag tied with cord, 2 quarts of lamp oil in a tin that had a slow leak staining the cloth beneath it, less than a quarter cord of scrap wood, ends and splits, and a few pieces of broken lath that had come loose from a freight pallet, the cracked sheet iron camp heater, the hand cart, the tools. Rusk said, "You filed a claim?" Emrys said he had filed on a quarter section 3 miles northwest of the siding. He had not built on it. He had not cut sod. He had planned to build in spring when the grading work paid enough for boards. Rusk said, "Spring." He said the word the way a man says the name of someone who has died. He told Emrys what a winterable shelter required on open prairie. A legal homestead dwelling could be as small as 8 by 10 feet. The Homestead Act demanded no more, but legal and livable were different words. 8 by 10 kept a claim agent satisfied. It did not keep a child warm. A family of 5 needed a tight soddy with walls 2 feet thick, or a dugout cut into a hillside, or a frame shanty with proper chinking and a sound stove. Any of those required fuel. 6 cords of wood, minimum, for a winter that started in late October and did not relent until April. More if the walls leaked. More if the stove drew poorly. More if the temperature dropped past 20 below and stayed there for a week. Emrys had less than a quarter cord. Rusk looked at Martha, who was sitting on the flour sack because standing made her cough. He looked at Nell, who was chewing on the handle of the tin cup. He looked back at Emrys. "You have 12 days, Rusk said. "Maybe 15 if October stays warm. After that, frost is not a warning. Frost is a sentence." Emrys asked about timber. Rusk told him what Emrys already suspected. The nearest trees worth cutting stood along the James River, and hauling logs without a team was not work for one man and a busted handcart. Lumber from the railroad depot cost more per board foot than Emrys had in total. Sod cutting required an ox-drawn breaking plow, neighbors willing to help, and time that did not exist. A dugout required a hillside, and the nearest cut bank was low, wet, and too soft to hold a roof. Every conventional path was closed. Rusk mounted his horse. He paused with one hand on the saddle horn and said, "I'm not saying this to be hard on you. I'm saying it because a man who knows his position can act on it. A man who pretends his position is better than it is dies pretending." He rode south without looking back. Martha waited until the horse was small against the grass. Then she said, "He is not wrong." Emrys said, "No." Martha said, "What are we going to do?" Emrys did not answer immediately. He was looking north, past the grading camp, past the rail line, toward the scrap siding where the Northern Pacific dumped what it no longer needed. He had walked past that siding every morning for 4 months on his way to the grading cut. He had seen what lay there. He had not thought about it as anything other than trash. Now he was thinking. The railroad scrap siding was 200 yards north of the camp, set off the main line on a short stub track that ended in a dirt berm. The Northern Pacific used it for disposal. Broken rails sat in rusted stacks. Bent spikes filled a half-rotted barrel. Axle journals, cracked wheel flanges, a tangle of telegraph wire, and 3 stovepipes of different diameters lay scattered across packed earth that was black with cinder and oil. Emrys was not looking for any of those things. He was looking at the boiler. It sat at the far end of the siding, half hidden behind a pile of warped ties. A locomotive boiler barrel stripped from a wrecked switching engine that had derailed and burned east of the siding the previous spring. The firebox was gone, salvaged for its copper stays. The tube bundle had been pulled and shipped back to the repair shops. What remained was the barrel alone, a riveted iron cylinder roughly 15 feet long and 4 feet across at its widest ring. Black with rust, scaled with old fire residue, open at both ends where the smokebox and firebox had been cut away. It was the largest single object on the siding. It was also the most useless, which was why no one had hauled it off for scrap. Moving a hollow iron cylinder that weighed more than a horse required equipment the railroad had not bothered to send. Emrys walked around it. He ran his hand along the curve. The iron was cold under his palm, and that coldness was the first thing he needed to understand. He remembered his father. Gethin Pritchard had been a boiler patcher and blacksmith in a Welsh mining town. He had taught Emrys to read metal the way a farmer reads soil, by touch, by color, by how it behaved under heat and cold. The lesson that mattered now was simple, and Emrys had learned it at 7 years old, with his palm held near a forge wall. His father had pressed a soot-black hand against the brick beside the forge after the fire had burned down for an hour. The brick was warm. Heat moved through it slowly, soaked into its weight, and came back out like breath. Then his father pressed the same hand against a bare iron plate leaning against the far wall. The iron was cold. It had given its heat away to the air as fast as the air could take it. One gives slowly, his father had said. One steals quickly. Metal exposed to wind was a killer. Every railman knew this. Brake wheels froze to skin in January. Iron rail burned bare hands in August. The same property that made iron deadly, its eagerness to match the temperature around it, also meant that if you could control what surrounded it, iron would hold whatever temperature you gave it. Emrys did not think of the boiler as a house. He did not think of it as a room. He thought of it as a sealed chamber, a space small enough to heat with almost nothing, strong enough to hold its shape against wind, and curved in a way that shed snow and rain without a ridge beam or rafters. The family did not need standing room. Standing room was a luxury that cost fuel. They needed a warm sleeping vault for the worst nights and a lean-to work area outside it for cooking and movement when weather allowed. The boiler barrel could be the vault, but only if the iron was never left naked. The principle was the same one his father had shown him. Bare iron exposed to Dakota wind would conduct heat out of the interior faster than any fire could replace it. The shell would become a freezing tube, exactly as dangerous as every practical man in the territory would expect. But if the exterior were buried, packed in earth, sod, brush, cinders, and later snow, the iron would be cut off from the wind entirely. The earth would insulate. The iron, no longer losing heat to the air, would absorb warmth from the interior fire and from the bodies inside, and it would hold that warmth and release it slowly, the way brick held warmth beside a forge. The design assembled itself in Emrys's mind, not as invention, but as memory applied to desperation. Drag the cylinder into the shallow drainage ditch south of the siding. Let the earth cover its sides halfway. Face the open east end away from the prevailing northwest wind. Seal both ends, the east end with a low door of canvas and timber hoops, the west end with sod blocks, scrap boards, and clay. Cut a small smoke opening through the upper curve using a chisel and a drift punch. Build a tiny clay-lined fire pan near the entrance. Not a roaring fire, never a roaring fire, because in a space this small, a large flame would consume the air and kill everyone inside. Lay willow slats and straw above the lower curve so no one slept with their body against iron. Pack earth, sod, brush, and eventually snow over the entire outside. Leave a fist-wide low vent at the door end and a high smoke vent at the opposite end so air moved through and smoke moved up and out. 2 openings, one small, one smaller. The difference between a shelter and a coffin. Emrys walked back to the pile of belongings. Martha was feeding Nell a piece of hard bread softened in water. Gwen was sorting the scrap wood into lengths. Tomos was asleep on the quilt. Martha looked at his face. She had been married to him for 11 years. She could read his expression the way he read metal. "You found something," she said. "I found an idea," Emrys said. "It will sound mad." "We are past mad," Martha said. "Tell me." He told her. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "How long to build it?" 10 days, maybe 12. Rusk said we have 12. Then I cannot be slow. Martha looked north toward the siding. She could not see the boiler from where she sat, but she looked as if she were measuring something in her mind. "If it fails," she said, "we freeze inside an iron tube instead of outside one." "Yes. And if it works?" "Then the iron holds us until spring." Martha picked up Nell and stood. Her legs shook, but she stood. "Show me," she said. The first man to call it an iron coffin was not Cyrus Tallow. It was Jonas Venn, and he did not mean it as cruelty. Jonas was 41, a freight handler who worked the siding platform and knew metal from 16-hour shifts loading and unloading rail cargo in every kind of weather. He had burned the pads of his fingers on sun-heated iron in August and frozen the same fingers to a brake lever in February. He understood what metal did to living tissue. When he saw Emrys stretching a length of twine around the boiler barrel's circumference, measuring the curve with the focus of a man who intended to live inside it, Jonas walked over and said what needed saying. "That will kill your family." Emrys did not look up from the twine. "Naked metal, yes." Jonas crouched beside the barrel and knocked his knuckles against it. The iron rang dull and flat, the sound of old scale over solid plate. "This is not a forge wall. This is a tube. Wind hits one side, cold goes straight through, and anything inside is colder than outside because metal pulls the heat right out of you. I have burned skin and frozen skin on the same kind of iron. I know what it does." Emrys said, "You are right about naked metal." "There is no other kind of metal," Jonas said. "There is buried metal." Jonas stared at him. "You mean to put it in the ground?" "Half in the ground, earth on the sides and top. The iron never touches wind." "And when it sweats inside? When moisture runs down the curve and soaks your bedding? When your children wake up wet in the dark?" "Slope and drainage, gravel sump at the low end." Jonas stood up. He looked at the boiler, then at the family's pile of belongings visible in the distance, then back at Emrys. He was not hostile. He was a man who had handled enough iron to know its nature, and he could not see past that nature to what Emrys was describing. "You cannot dress a boiler for winter," Jonas said. "I am not dressing it," Emrys said. "I am burying it." Jonas left shaking his head, but he did not laugh. That was the difference between Jonas Venn and what came next. Cyrus Tallow arrived 2 days later, and Cyrus Tallow did laugh. Tallow was 48 years old, the owner of a feed store and land office at the nearest settlement east of the siding. He bought and sold claims the way other men bought and sold horses, watching for distress, waiting for desperation, and offering just enough to make surrender feel like a transaction. Abandoned homesteads were his best inventory. A family that broke and left forfeited improvements that Tallow could claim, resell, or hold until the land appreciated. The Pritchards interested him. A man with $3, no shelter, and a wife too sick to travel was a man who would sell his claim for passage money if the first freeze came hard enough. Tallow had seen it happen 6 times in 3 years. What Tallow did not want was for Emrys to survive the winter on that claim. Survival meant the claim stayed filed. Survival meant improvements. Survival meant one less desperate seller. So when Tallow rode out to the siding and saw Emrys waist-deep in a drainage ditch, measuring the width with a broken yardstick while Martha held pegs and Gwen counted paces, Tallow stopped his horse and made sure his voice carried. "I heard a rumor," Tallow said, "that a man out here was building a house from a rusted boiler. I came to see for myself." Emrys kept measuring. "I see it now," Tallow said. He turned to the 2 men riding with him, a clerk and a freight driver. "He is going to bury his children in an iron coffin." The clerk smiled. The freight driver looked uncomfortable. Tallow dismounted. He walked to the edge of the ditch and looked down at Emrys the way a man looks at a dog that has crawled under a porch. "A man too poor for boards has no business inventing walls," Tallow said. Emrys said nothing. He drove a peg into the ditch floor and stretched the twine to the next mark. Tallow's voice changed, lower, not for the men behind him, but for Emrys alone. "You have a sick wife and 3 small children. The church deacon in town takes in families. Widow Garretson has room. You could work freight through winter and rebuild in spring. No one would think less of you." It sounded generous. Martha, who had come close enough to hear, looked at Emrys. For a moment the offer hung in the air like something real. Emrys straightened up. He looked at Tallow. What happens to the claim? Tallow did not blink. A man who cannot improve his claim in time forfeits it. That is the law. I did not write it. And you would file on it. Someone would. The generosity dissolved. What remained was the transaction underneath it. Abandon the claim, accept charity, and Tallow would own the quarter section before the snow melted. Emrys turned back to his pegs. We are not leaving. Tallow remounted. As he turned his horse, he said loudly enough for Martha and Gwen to hear, when those children are sick from smoke or frozen to iron, the sheriff will want to know who let a proud fool kill his family. He rode east. The freight driver followed. The clerk lingered a moment, watching Emrys measure, then followed too. Martha waited until they were gone. She was coughing again, the deep wet sound that meant the fever had not fully broken. He wants us to fail, she said. He needs us to fail, Emrys said. There is a difference. Martha sat on the edge of the ditch. Nell climbed into her lap. The wind picked up from the northwest, and Martha pulled the quilt around both of them. Emrys, she said. Her voice was quiet. Is this cleverness or pride? He did not answer. He drove another peg. The question stayed in the air between them, and he knew it would stay there until the iron proved one answer or the other. Moving the boiler was the first impossible task. The cylinder sat 32 yards from the ditch, 32 yards of uneven ground, cinder, and packed earth. The barrel weighed more than Emrys could calculate precisely, but he could feel its weight when he leaned against it, and nothing moved. He pressed his shoulder into the curve and pushed until his boots slid. The iron did not shift. He needed rollers, cribbing, and leverage. He had no team, no block and tackle, and no one willing to help a man the freight platform, already called the iron coffin builder. On the first morning, he cut 3 lengths of pole from a broken fence rail and shaped them round enough to serve as rollers. He chalked the boiler with stones, wedged the first roller beneath the downhill edge, and levered with a fence post. The barrel shifted 1 inch. He repositioned. It shifted another inch, 2 inches in 20 minutes. 32 yards was 1,152 inches. He did the arithmetic and felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. Martha could not lift. Her arms shook when she raised them above her waist. But she could braid rags into rope. And she did, sitting beside the ditch with Nell on the quilt and a pile of torn cloth in her lap. The rope would lash the rollers in position so they did not kick free when the barrel's weight shifted. Gwen counted. Every time the barrel moved, Gwen called out the distance. 1 foot, 2 feet, stop. She said it without emotion, the way a person reads numbers from a scale. She was 10 years old, and she understood that counting was the only thing she could do that mattered. By the end of the first day, the barrel had moved 4 feet. Emrys's palms were torn open across the base of both thumbs where the fence post had twisted in his grip. He wrapped them in rags and did not show Martha. The second day was worse. Rain came before noon, cold rain that turned the ground slick and made the rollers slide sideways instead of forward. The barrel slipped off the rollers twice. The second time, it rolled a quarter turn and nearly crushed Emrys's foot. He yanked his boot clear and sat in the mud for a full minute, breathing, feeling the closeness of the miss in his chest. Tomos brought him water. Tomos did not ask if they were going to ride the train. By the evening of the second day, the barrel had moved 9 feet. By the morning of the third day, Emrys could not close his hands. The torn skin had stiffened overnight, and bending his fingers sent bright pain up both forearms. He soaked his hands in warm water from the kettle, forced his fingers open, wrapped them again, and went back to the siding. He was repositioning the rollers when a voice behind him said, "You chalked it right." Emrys turned. A man stood at the edge of the cinder pile with his hands in his coat pockets and his head tilted, studying the barrel the way a man studies a problem he has seen before. Tollef Brekka was 64 years old. He was Norwegian, born in a valley near Bergen, and he had come to Dakota Territory by way of Minnesota, where he had worked as a blacksmith and a boilermaker's helper on Mississippi riverboats. His hands were enormous, scarred across every knuckle, and black around the nails with metal dust that no amount of washing would remove. He had a face like folded leather and a voice that sounded like gravel dragged across a plate. He said, "You know round weight." "My father patched boilers," Emrys said. "Then you know round weight shifts when it wants to, not when you want it to. You need crib blocks and short poles. Short poles roll, long poles lever. You're trying to do both with the same stick, and that is why your hands are bleeding." Emrys looked at his wrapped palms. "I have what I have." Tolliff walked to the broken tie pile and began sorting through it. He pulled out 4 short lengths, each about 2 feet, and kicked them toward the barrel. "Crib under the low side, wedge the high side, roll to the crib, recrib. You move inches, not feet, and nothing crushes you." "I did not ask for help," Emrys said. "You did not ask for help," Tolliff agreed. "I did not offer any. I told you how round weight moves. What you do with that is your own trouble." He turned and walked toward the freight platform. After 6 steps, he stopped and said, without turning around, "The far end, the one that was the smoke box. There is a hairline crack running from the 2nd rivet row to the 5th. Chalk around every suspect seam. Where soot lines appear on the chalk, air will leak. Fix those before you seal the ends, or your smoke will go where you do not want it." Then he kept walking. Emrys stood in the rain with 4 crib blocks at his feet and a piece of advice that would save 2 days of wasted sealing. He did not call after Tolliff. He picked up the first crib block and placed it. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who did not understand what you were building? That evening, Emrys did something Martha did not expect. Instead of working on the barrel, he built a small fire near the tent and set 2 pieces of scrap iron beside it. One piece he left bare, propped on a stone so air could reach every surface. The other piece he packed in a mound of damp earth and dead grass, burying it until only the edge showed. Gwen watched. She said, "What are you doing?" "Testing," Emrys said. He let the fire heat both pieces for 20 minutes. The flames licked at the bare plate and warmed the earth mound equally. Then he pulled both pieces away from the fire and set them 3 feet apart in the open air, where the evening wind was picking up from the northwest. "Wait," he told Gwen. They waited. After 10 minutes, Emrys said, "Touch the bare plate. Careful. Just your palm close, not on it." Gwen held her hand an inch above the bare iron. "Cold," she said. "Already cold." Now the buried one. He scraped the earth away from the second plate's surface. Gwen held her palm above it. Her eyes changed. "Warm," she said. "Still warm." "The iron is the same iron," Emrys said. "The fire was the same fire. The air is the same air. The difference is the earth." Martha had come close enough to feel for herself. She held her hand over the buried plate and kept it there. The warmth was not strong. It was not like holding your hand near a stove. But it was there, a low-held heat that the bare plate had already surrendered to the wind. "The earth stops the wind from stealing," Martha said. It was not a question. "The earth stops the wind from stealing," Emrys said, "and the iron holds what the earth protects." He looked at Martha. She looked at the warm plate, then at the cold one, then at the boiler barrel sitting on its rollers in the last light. "Show Jonas," she said. "Jonas will not come." "Then show Rusk." "Rusk will not come either, not yet." Martha pulled her hand back. "Then finish moving it, and do not die under it." By the 4th day, using Tolliff's cribbing method, the barrel moved 8 feet. The difference was immediate. Short poles rolled the cylinder forward in controlled lengths. Crib blocks locked each gain. The barrel still weighed enough to kill, but it moved in a rhythm now, lever, roll, crib, reset, that turned impossible arithmetic into slow, countable progress. Tolliff did not come back on the 4th day. He did not come back on the 5th. But on the 5th afternoon, Emrys found a piece of chalk sitting on the barrel's upper curve, placed where the hairline crack started. No note, no footprint he could identify in the trampled cinder. Just chalk, exactly where it was needed. Emrys chalked every suspect seam on the barrel that evening. He worked by lamplight, running the chalk in wide bands over every rivet row, every plate join, every dimple where corrosion had eaten into the surface. He would check them in the morning. Where soot or dark lines bled through the chalk, air was moving through the metal, and air meant smoke going where it should not go, and heat escaping where it could not be afforded. By the 5th day, the barrel had moved another 7 feet. Emrys's hands bled through the rags every morning, and every morning he wrapped them again. Martha braided more rope. She was stronger now. The fever had loosened its grip enough that she could stand for an hour without shaking, though her cough still woke the children at night. Gwen counted every shift of the barrel. Tomos carried water and crib blocks, staggering under their weight, but refusing to make 2 trips when 1 trip and a red face would do. On the morning of the 6th day, Jonas Venn walked past the siding and saw the barrel sitting 14 feet from where it had started. He stopped. He looked at the chalk marks. He looked at the crib blocks arranged in a line like teeth. He looked at Emrys, who was soaking his hands in a tin of warm water, and did not look up. Jonas said, "You moved it." Emrys said nothing. Jonas said, "The chalk. Who told you to chalk the seams?" "A man who knows boilers." Jonas stood there for a long time. Then he said, "You still cannot heat iron in a ditch." He walked away, but he walked slowly, and he looked back twice. That was progress of a different kind. On the 6th morning, Emrys woke to frost on the tent canvas. He pressed his palm against the fabric and felt the cold through the cloth like a hand pressing back. The temperature had dropped overnight, not to killing cold, but to the kind of cold that announces what is coming. The grass was white. The puddles had skins of ice that cracked under Nell's boots and made her laugh. The laugh sounded too loud against the silence of a prairie that was bracing itself. 12 days, Rusk had said. 6 were gone. The barrel was 19 feet from the ditch. 13 feet remained. The trench was not dug. The ends were not sealed. The smoke vent was not cut. The bedding platform did not exist. The clay ceiling had not begun. The fire pan was unshaped. The ventilation, the 2 small openings that meant the difference between shelter and suffocation, existed only in Emrys's mind. And somewhere to the northwest, beyond the flat line where grass met sky, the season was turning with the slow certainty of a wheel that could not be stopped. 13 feet to the ditch, then the ditch to dig, then the ends to seal, then the vent to cut, then the clay to mix and pack, then the bedding to build, then the fire pan to shape, then the earth to pile over every inch of exposed iron so that the wind that had already turned cold enough to frost canvas, could not touch the metal that was supposed to keep his children alive. Emrys wrapped his hands. He stood. He walked to the barrel. The cold was not waiting, and neither was Cyrus Tallow, who had been asking questions at the land office about the filing date on a certain quarter section 3 miles northwest of the siding. On the 7th day, Tolif Brecka came back. He did not announce himself. He walked to the barrel at first light carrying a canvas roll under one arm and a short-handled sledge in the other. Emrys was already at the crib blocks, resetting for the morning's first roll. His hands were wrapped in rags dark with old blood, and he moved his fingers the way a man moves something that hurts every time it bends. Tolif set the canvas roll on the ground and opened it. Inside were 6 iron wedges of different sizes, a flat-nosed drift punch, a cold chisel with a fresh edge, and a rivet set that looked older than Emrys. "I did not ask," Emrys started. "You did not ask," Tolif said. "And I am not giving. I am working. There is a difference. A man who works beside another man is not doing charity. He is doing the thing in front of him." Emrys looked at the tools. The drift punch alone was worth more than everything he owned. "Why?" he said. Tolif picked up a wedge and turned it in his hand. "Because you chalked the seams. A fool would have sealed first and wondered why smoke came through the walls. You checked the iron before you trusted it. That is not something a desperate man usually does. That is something a man who knows metal does." He drove the wedge under the barrel's low side and nodded at Emrys. "Roll." They moved the barrel 6 feet before noon. With 2 men working the levers and crib blocks, the rhythm doubled. Lever, roll, crib, reset, lever, roll, crib, reset. Tolliff did not talk while they worked. He grunted at the lever points and said, "Hold," when the barrel shifted wrong, and "go," when it settled right. His hands on the poles were sure in a way that made Emrys understand what 20 years of handling heavy iron looked like from the outside. By evening, the barrel sat at the lip of the drainage ditch. Martha brought them water and hard bread. She watched Tolliff eat and said, "Thank you." Tolliff said, "Do not thank me yet. Getting it to the ditch is the easy half. Getting it into the ditch without it rolling over your husband is the hard half." The ditch was the next battle, and the ground fought them for every inch. Days 8 and 9 were digging. The trench needed to be wide enough to cradle the barrel's lower curve, shallow enough that the top of the cylinder would rise above grade for the door and smoke vent, and deep enough that earth could be piled against the sides to cover at least 2/3 of the iron surface. The soil was heavy, Dakota clay mixed with gravel and old roots from prairie grass that had been growing since before anyone alive had been born. Each shovel load weighed more than the last because the deeper they dug, the wetter the clay became. Emrys dug. Tolliff dug beside him. Martha carried the spoil in buckets, moving slowly but moving. Gwen stacked the excavated earth into piles sorted by type. Clay in one pile for sealing, gravel in another for drainage, black topsoil in a third for the outer insulation layer. She did this without being told. Emrys watched her sorting and realized his 10-year-old daughter understood the project better than most of the men at the freight platform. Tomos hauled gravel from the railroad ash pit in the handcart. The cart's missing tire made it pull hard to the left, and Tomos leaned right to compensate, his small body angled against the weight like a sapling bent by wind. He made 11 trips on the 8th day. Emrys counted them because counting his son's labor was easier than thinking about what it meant that a 7-year-old was hauling gravel instead of playing. On the 9th evening, the trench was done. 4 feet deep at the center, sloping to 3 feet at the east end where the door would be. 18 inches of gravel, broken brick, and cinders from the ash pit lined the bottom. The drainage slope ran east, away from the sealed west end, so that any water inside would flow toward the door and out through a shallow channel Tolliff had insisted on cutting. "Water is the second enemy," Tolliff said. "After air leaks and before smoke, a man can survive cold air. He cannot survive wet bedding at 10 below zero. The water must always have somewhere to go that is not where your children sleep." Emrys marked that: air, water, smoke. The same 3 words he had scratched on the board when Rusk and Tallow had confronted him. The order mattered. We see lowering the barrel into the trench nearly killed them both. On the morning of the 10th day, Tolliff and Emrys built a ramp of crib blocks and short poles from the lip of the ditch to the bottom. The idea was to ease the barrel down the ramp using ropes looped around the cylinder and braked against stakes driven into the ground on either side. Tolliff had done this on riverboats, with boilers 3 times this size, he said. But on riverboats he had 4 men and a winch. Here he had himself, a man with torn hands and a rope made of braided rags. The barrel began to slide at 9 in the morning. For the first 2 feet, the ropes held, and the descent was controlled. Then the left rope, the one anchored to a stake that Emrys had driven into soil, softened by 2 days of rain, pulled free. The stake ripped out of the ground like a tooth from a jaw. The barrel lurched left, and for one terrible second it tipped on the ramp's edge, and Emrys saw it rolling sideways into the ditch with Tolliff standing directly below. Martha screamed. Gwen grabbed Nell and pulled her back. Tomos froze. Tolliff did not freeze. He drove his shoulder under the barrel's curve and pushed upward with his legs, bracing the roll just long enough for the right rope to catch the weight. The barrel groaned on the poles, hung at an angle that looked wrong from every direction, and then slid the rest of the way down the ramp and settled into the trench with a sound like a church bell struck with a fist. Tolliff climbed out of the ditch. His left shoulder was bleeding through his shirt where a rivet head had torn the skin. He looked at the barrel sitting in the trench, its curve fitting the excavation the way a body fits a bed. "That," he said, "is why you do not do this alone." Emrys said nothing. His hands were shaking, not from cold. With the barrel in the ditch, the work changed. Digging and rolling became sealing and shaping, and Tolliff's knowledge shifted from brute labor to craft. He taught Emrys rivet reading first. They crawled along the barrel's interior with a lamp, and Tolliff pointed to each chalk mark that showed dark lines bleeding through. There, air moves through that seam. Feel it. Emrys held his damp palm near the mark and felt a whisper of cold moving through the joint where two plates overlapped. One plate, one rivet row, one thread of moving air that multiplied across 30 seams would drain heat from the interior as fast as any fire could make it. You seal from the inside first, Tolliff said. Clay, ash, chopped grass, and hair. Hair from a horse blanket if you have it. The grass holds the clay together. The ash fills the smallest gaps. The hair gives it strength when it dries. Mix it stiff. Press it into the seam with your thumb. Then smooth it flat so no one catches a shoulder on it in the dark. They sealed 14 seams on the 10th day and 9 more on the 11th. The clay mixture was foul. It smelled of ash and wet horse and rotting grass, but it packed into the joints and held. Emrys tested each seal with the lamp held close. Where the flame flickered, air still moved. Where the flame burned steady, the seal was good. Draft control came next. Tolliff made Emrys cut the smoke vent himself, using the cold chisel and drift punch on the barrel's upper curve near the west end. The work took 4 hours. Iron filings coated Emrys's arms and face. The hole, when finished, was 6 inches across, no larger. Emrys said it looked too small. Tolliff said, "A big hole means a big draft. A big draft means fire draws hard, burns fast, and sucks heat up and out. You do not want a chimney. You want a slow leak that lets smoke out and keeps heat in, a small high vent and a low intake on the opposite end. Air comes in low, warms, rises, carries smoke to the vent. If you make the holes bigger, you make the shelter colder." The low intake was easier, a fist-wide opening near the base of the east end door, positioned so that incoming air would travel the full length of the barrel before reaching the smoke vent. The longer the air path, the more heat it collected on the way through. On the 11th day, Jonas Venn appeared at the edge of the ditch. He had a spoke shave in his hand. He looked at the barrel, looked at the end hoops Emrys was trying to shape from bent fence rail, and said, "Your hoops will not hold because you are cutting against the grain." Emrys said nothing. Jonas set the spokeshave on the edge of the ditch. "It is not help," he said. "It is alone, so your bad work does not kill your children." He left. The spokeshave stayed. Emrys picked it up and fitted the first end hoop in half the time the broken draw knife would have taken. On the 12th morning, the first real cold came. Not frost. Cold. The kind that turned breath to white rope and made the water in the cooking pot grow a rim of ice before noon. The wind came steady from the northwest, and it carried a sound that Emrys had learned to recognize in his first Dakota winter, a low, constant moan across the grass that meant the air was moving faster than a man could walk. The east end of the barrel had its frame, 2 timber hoops, cross-braced, with canvas stretched over them and stiffened with a layer of clay on the exterior. The west end was packed with sod blocks, scrap boards, and 3 inches of clay ceiling. Inside, the lower curve was covered with willow slats that Gwen and Tomos had gathered from a creek bed half a mile south. Straw and dried grass lay over the slats, and above them the 2 narrow sleeping shelves that would keep the family's bodies off the iron. But the earth was not yet piled over the outside. The insulation, the layer that would make the difference between a shelter and an iron trap, was incomplete. Emrys needed to cover the barrel's exposed surface with at least 10 inches of packed earth, sod, brush, and cinders. Without it, the iron would conduct the cold straight through to the interior, and everything he had built would be exactly the death trap Jonas and Tallow predicted. He calculated. Moving that much earth by hand with a broken shovel and a one-wheeled handcart would take 3 more days. He did not have 3 more days. The cold told him that. The wind told him that. The sky, which had turned the color of old tin, told him that. Alva Rusk rode up at midday. He dismounted and walked the length of the trench without speaking. He looked at the sealed seams. He looked at the smoke vent. He looked at the drainage channel. He crouched and ran his hand along the clay seal on the west end, pressing with his thumb the way a man tests mortar. "The ceiling is better than I expected," Rusk said. "The ceiling was not my work alone," Emrys said. Rusk stood. "You need earth on the outside, a great deal of it. And you need it before the ground freezes, because frozen ground does not shovel." "I know." "How long?" 3 days. "You have 1, maybe 2. Rusk mounted. He sat in the saddle for a moment, looking at the barrel in the ditch, the half-finished earth piles, the family, the tools, the whole unlikely arrangement of salvage and desperation. "If that shell sweats inside, your blankets freeze," he said. "If smoke hangs low, your girl does not wake up. If the ground floods, you drown lying down." It was the same warning he had given before, almost word for word, but his voice was different. The first time he had said it as a verdict. This time he said it as a list, as though he were naming the problems a man might solve if the man were serious enough to hear them. He rode south. Before dawn the next morning, Emrys found 2 oxen tied to a stake near the ditch. No note. No name. The rope was army surplus, the kind Rusk would have. Emrys hitched the oxen to the handcart and moved more earth in that single day than he had moved in the previous 3 combined. Martha filled, Gwen leveled, Tomos packed with a flat board. Tolliff appeared in the afternoon and helped shape the earth berming so that it tapered at the ends and thickened at the crown, shedding water instead of holding it. By evening, the barrel was buried. Only the east end door, the smoke vent collar, and a thin strip of iron along the crown still showed above the earth. Everything else was hidden under sod, cinders, brush, and packed clay. The mound looked like a grave. It looked like nothing a family should live inside. But when Emrys crawled through the low door and lit the fire pan, a shallow clay dish no wider than 2 outstretched hands, holding a fistful of wood scraps and a lick of lamp oil. The iron began to warm. Not hot, not comfortable. But the cold stopped at the walls. Russ came back that evening to collect the oxen. He looked at the finished mound, at the thin column of smoke rising from the vent, at the canvas door glowing faintly with firelight from inside. "If I come back and that boiler has rolled onto someone," he said, "I will say I told you so over your grave." It was not kindness. It was not approval. But it was not the verdict anymore either. It was something between a warning and a wish. The shelter was finished enough to test on October 14th. It looked like something that should be dug up and apologized for. A low mound of rust-stained earth and dead brush, 32 yards from the scrap siding, with a smoke-blackened vent collar poking from the top and a canvas flap for a door. Inside, the space was dark, close, and curved. 2 sleeping shelves ran along the upper sides, each wide enough for 1 adult or 2 children pressed together. The lower pallet sat on willow slats above the barrel's bottom curve. The fire pan occupied a clay platform near the east door. The smoke vent opened near the west end, with a piece of scrap tin that could be adjusted to control the draw. Emrys hung 2 tin cups of water from wire hooks, one inside the cylinder, one outside under a canvas lean-to he had built against the mound's east face. The lean-to served as a cooking area and workspace, a place to stand upright, which the barrel did not allow. Overnight, the temperature dropped, not to the killing cold that was coming, but enough to test the principle. In the morning, the outside cup had a skin of ice across its surface. The inside cup was liquid. The water was not warm, but it was not frozen, and that difference between liquid and ice, between survivable and not, was everything. Tolliff examined the interior that morning. He pressed his palm against the iron wall and held it there. "It holds," he said. Quiet. As if surprised, though his face did not show surprise. Jonas Venn came by in the afternoon. He had heard about the water test. He said it proved nothing because the wind had been low. "The true test is not cold alone," Jonas said. "It is wind, snow load, wet bedding, smoke backing up, and frightened children breathing in a sealed tube at midnight. One calm night with a cup of water is not winter." Jonas was right. and everyone knew it. Tolliff spent that evening forcing Emrys to practice something no one else would have thought to rehearse. He stuffed the smoke vent with a rag, letting smoke thicken inside the barrel until the air burned Emrys's throat and his eyes streamed. Then he made Emrys clear the vent blindfolded. Emrys fumbled. Smoke poured across his face. He coughed until his ribs hurt, found the vent collar by touch, and pulled the rag free. Again, Tolliff said. They did it 4 times. By the 4th time, Emrys could find the vent in 3 breaths. Tolliff said, "At midnight in a storm, your eyes will be useless. Your hands must know the way." Emrys cursed him. Tolliff did not smile, but something in his face changed, a kind of recognition, the look of a man who sees someone learning the thing that will save them. On the evening of October 14th, a telegraph operator at the Jamestown depot passed word along the line, storm warnings east of the James River. The air had turned warm during the afternoon, wrong warm, the kind that felt like the sky holding its breath, and then dropped sharply after sundown. The wind swung north. Clouds came in low and fast, the undersides lit orange by a sun that was already gone. Martha stood outside the mound and watched the sky change color. She held Nell against her hip. Gwen stood beside her. Tomos was inside the barrel, arranging the bedding on the shelves. "It is coming," Martha said. Emrys nodded. He had 1.5 sacks of flour, 5 pounds of beans, a 1/4 quart of scrap wood, and a fire pan that held enough fuel for 6 hours if he burned it slow. He looked at the mound. He looked at his family. He opened the canvas door. "Get inside," he said. October 15th, 1880. The wind rose before dawn. It began as a sound, a low keening that came from the northwest and built until it was not a sound anymore, but a pressure, a weight against the canvas door that made the fabric bow inward like a sail. Rain struck first, hard and horizontal, driven by gusts that found every gap in the lean-to and tore the cooking canvas loose from its stakes. Then the rain turned to sleet, the sleet turned to snow, and the snow did not stop. By mid-morning, the prairie outside the mound had vanished. There was no horizon, no siding, no rail line. There was only white and wind and a roar that made speech impossible unless you pressed your mouth against someone's ear. Inside the barrel, the family lay on the shelves and the lower pallet. Emrys kept the fire pan burning low, a palm-sized flame that ate wood scraps the way a sick animal eats, slowly and without appetite. The smoke vent drew upward. The low intake pulled fresh air along the barrel's length. The system worked. For the first 3 hours. At hour 3, the wind shifted. It came around to the east, directly into the door end, and the draft reversed. Smoke that had been rising obediently to the vent suddenly flattened and spread along the ceiling of the barrel. In a space 4 feet across, the ceiling was 18 inches above a person lying on the upper shelf. Smoke filled that 18 inches in less than a minute. Martha coughed. Nell began to cry. Tomos, who was lying on the lower pallet, said his eyes burned. Emrys's hands found the vent collar in the dark. The vent was clear. No blockage, no snowpacking. The problem was not the vent. The problem was the wind pushing air backward through the system, turning the intake into an exhaust and the exhaust into an intake. He needed to block the low intake. He grabbed a rag, wet it in the water cup, and stuffed it into the fist-wide opening near the door base. The incoming wind stopped. The smoke began to thin as the vent reasserted its draw. But now fresh air was cut off. In a sealed iron tube holding 5 people, the air would turn bad in less than an hour. Gwen said, "Tolliff's drill." She said it calmly, the way she counted feet when the barrel rolled. She was 10 years old and she remembered. She crawled from the upper shelf to the door end. She opened the canvas flap 1 hand's width, not enough to admit the full force of the wind, but enough to let a thin stream of air enter above the blocked intake. The wind roared through the gap and spattered sleet across the pallet, but the smoke lifted. The draft found its direction again. Gwen held the flap at that width with both hands, bracing it against the gusts, while snow collected in her hair. Emrys pulled her back and wedged a piece of board in the gap to hold it. The board vibrated with each gust, a buzzing sound like a wasp trapped in a jar. The smoke cleared. The air moved. The fire pan kept burning. At hour 5, meltwater appeared. Snow that had packed against the canvas door was melting from the heat inside, and the water ran along the lower curve of the barrel toward the bedding. The gravel sump at the east end caught some of it, but the flow was faster than the sump could drain. Water pooled under the lower pallet. Emrys cut a rag into strips and built a dam across the barrel's floor, forcing the water into the drainage channel Tollef had cut. Martha packed straw behind the dam to absorb what the channel could not carry. The bedding on the lower pallet was damp, not soaked, damp. In the dark, Emrys could feel the difference with his hands, and the difference was the width of a knife blade between tolerable and dangerous. At hour 8, the west end failed. The clay plug that sealed the back of the barrel cracked with a sound like a pistol shot. Cold air screamed through the gap, a jet of wind and snow that hit Martha in the back where she lay on the upper shelf. She gasped. The temperature inside the barrel dropped so fast that Emrys could feel it on his face, a wave of cold rushing from west to east like water through a broken dam. Martha did not panic. She rolled over, pressed the quilt against the crack, and held it there with her body. Emrys crawled to her and packed warm ash from the fire pan behind the quilt, then mixed clay from the reserve bucket with the ash and pressed it into the seam. The clay was cold and stiff and did not want to hold. He pressed harder. His torn hands left blood in the clay. The crack sealed. The cold stopped. But the warmth that had been building for 12 hours was halved. The fire pan had to work twice as hard. Emrys fed it 3 more pieces of scrap wood and watched the flames eat them in minutes. He counted what remained. Enough for another 12 hours if he burned slow. 18 if he let the family shiver. If you are invested in this story, hit subscribe and stay with us, because the next few minutes decide whether this strange shelter is a refuge or a tomb. At hour 12, someone pounded on the canvas door. Emrys opened it, and wind and snow filled the entrance. A man fell through the gap on his hands and knees, shaking so violently that his elbows knocked against the barrel floor with a metallic ring. His fingers were gray. His lips were the color of wet clay. His coat was crusted with ice so thick it crackled when he moved. It was Lem Pike. 26 years old, hired hand for Cyrus Tallow, the same man who had called the boiler an iron coffin to anyone who would listen. Lem Pike's claim shanty, a flat-roofed frame shack with tar paper walls, had lost its roof to the wind 3 hours earlier. He had stumbled south through the blizzard because the mound was the only structure he could find that was still standing. Behind him, in the doorway, Jonas Venn appeared. Jonas had come searching for Lem after the shanty collapsed. He had followed Lem's tracks in the snow until the snow filled them, then followed the smell of smoke until he found the mound. When Emrys opened the canvas flap, Jonas saw steam and smoke roll out of the entrance of the iron coffin. He expected to see death. He expected to find a family frozen to the walls or suffocated by smoke in a sealed metal tube. He heard children breathing. Emrys pulled Lem inside. The heat loss was immediate. The open door let 10 seconds of storm into a space that could not afford to lose a single degree. Emrys sealed the flap and felt the cold hanging in the air like a living thing. The fire pan was burning low. He fed it another piece of wood. 6 people now. 5 Pritchards and a man whose fingers might already be dead. The barrel was built for 5. 6 meant less air, more moisture from breathing, more body heat, but also more oxygen consumed. Martha took Lem's hands and held them against her stomach under the quilt. Lem made a sound that was not a word. Gwen tucked the patched blanket around his legs. Tomos moved to make room on the lower pallet, pressing himself against the barrel's curve. Jonas Venn stood in the doorway, half inside, half out, snow driving past him. He looked at the family arranged in the barrel, at the fire pan burning, at the iron walls that were not frost-covered, at the water cup hanging from its hook with liquid still inside it. He said, "How?" Emrys said, "Come inside or close the door." Jonas came inside. The storm lasted 2 nights and the day between. During the second night, Tomos stopped answering Martha when she called his name. His fever, which had started as a shiver on the first afternoon, had climbed until his forehead burned under Emers's palm. He lay on the lower pallet with his eyes half open and his breath coming in short, shallow draws. Martha held him and sang something in Welsh that Emrys had not heard since his own mother sang it. Lempike's fingers went from gray to white to a color that Emrys did not want to name. 2 fingers on the left hand, 3 on the right. Jonas, who had seen frostbite on freight handlers, said nothing about the fingers. He helped Emrys clear the smoke vent when snow packed against it at dawn on the second day, and he held the canvas flap when the wind shifted east again and the draft reversed a second time. He did these things without comment, as though he had always understood how the shelter worked, though everyone in the barrel knew he had called it a death trap 4 days ago. Outside, the world was ending for anyone who was not underground or buried in earth. A flat-roofed claim shack 2 miles east lost its tar paper roof and then its walls. The family inside, a couple and their infant, crawled into a root cellar and survived, but the husband's feet froze so badly he would not walk without a cane again. A canvas tent at the railroad camp collapsed under snow weight and was found empty. The occupant had crawled to the grading foreman's cabin and pounded on the door until someone opened it. Alva Rusk's cabin survived, but Rusk burned through wood at a pace that frightened him. His walls were solid, but they were thin, and the wind found every crack between the logs and every gap around the doorframe. He fed his stove all night and woke to a woodpile that had shrunk by a quarter in 12 hours. He calculated what remained and calculated what winter had left to give, and the arithmetic made him sit down. Tallow's storehouse lost a section of roofing. Snow and sleet soaked 40 sacks of flour. The feed store's walls held, but the windows, glass panes freighted at great cost from Fargo, cracked from the pressure differential between heated air inside and howling cold outside. Tallow spent the second night stuffing blankets into window frames while his inventory rotted. Inside the barrel, Emrys Pritchard burned less fuel in 2 days than Rusk burned in 1 night. The cylinder's small volume heated quickly. The earth insulation stopped the wind from stripping that heat away. The curved walls had no corners where cold air could pool and stagnate. The iron, protected from the storm by 10 inches of packed earth, absorbed warmth from the fire and from the bodies and from the breath of 6 people, and it held that warmth and released it slowly, the way Emrys's father had shown him a forge wall held warmth after the fire was banked. The barrel was not warm. Warmth was not the point. The point was that the cold could not get in as fast as the small fire, and the 6 bodies could push it back. On the morning of October 17th, the wind dropped. Snow still fell, but it fell straight down instead of sideways, which on the Dakota plains meant the worst was past. Emrys opened the canvas door and saw white. White ground, white sky, white air. The scrap siding had vanished under drifts. The rail line was a faint depression in a field of snow. The lean-to was buried. The mound itself was barely visible, a low white hill with a dark vent collar and a thin thread of smoke. Emrys climbed out and stood on the mound. His legs shook from 2 days of lying in a cylinder. The cold hit his face like a hand, and he breathed it in and felt it burn his lungs in a way that the air inside the barrel had not. He was alive. His family was alive. A man who had mocked them was inside the barrel with his dead fingers held against Martha's warmth, and the fire pan still had fuel for 6 more hours. Alva Rusk arrived on horseback 2 hours after the wind died. He dismounted at the mound and stood looking at it the way a man looks at a thing he had expected to be a grave. Emrys was outside, clearing snow from the vent collar. Martha was inside with the children. Lem Pike was inside with his hands wrapped in wool and his face the color of old paper. Rusk said, "I want to see the inside." Emrys held the canvas flap open. Rusk crouched and entered. He was inside for a long time. When he came out, he stood in the snow and said nothing for a while. Then he said, "The children are asleep." "Yes." "The boy, Tomos, he has a fever." "Yes." "The water cup is not frozen." "No." "The fire is nearly out." Nearly. Rusk placed his palm against the iron where it showed above the earth near the vent collar. He held it there. The iron was not hot. It was not cold. It was the temperature of a living thing, blood warm, held warm, the kind of warmth that came not from fire, but from mass that had soaked heat for 2 days and was still giving it back. Rusk pulled his hand away. He looked at Emrys. I called it an iron coffin, Rusk said. You did. I was wrong about the coffin. I was not wrong about the danger. You beat the danger one seam at a time. He mounted his horse. Then he said, Tallow lost 40 sacks of flour. His storehouse roof failed. He has been asking who is responsible for the boiler shelter, and he is not asking because he is impressed. The storm was over. The shelter had held. But Emrys could hear in Rusk's voice that survival had created a new kind of danger, the kind that came not from wind and cold, but from a man who could not afford to let a poor family succeed on land he wanted. The storm had been over for 2 days when the first stranger came to the mound. She was a widow named Elna Tveit, 51 years old, Norwegian, with a face cut deep by wind and grief. Her husband had died the previous March from a fall off a half-built roof. She had a quarter section a mile east of the rail line and a sod house that had survived the blizzard, but her chicken coop, a lean-to of scrapboards and old canvas, had collapsed under the snow. 8 hens were dead. 4 survived by pressing into a corner where a sheet of iron roofing had fallen over them like a tent. She did not come to Emrys because she admired him. She came because Alva Rusk had mentioned, while helping her clear the debris, that a family had survived 2 nights inside a buried iron cylinder using less fuel than Rusk had burned in one. Elna stood at the edge of the mound and looked at it. She looked at the smoke coming from the vent collar. She looked at the canvas door. She looked at Emrys, who was outside repairing the lean-to cooking area, while Martha fed the children inside. Rusk says you kept water liquid in there during the worst of it, Elna said. The cup did not freeze, Emrys said. That is not the same as warm. I do not need warm, Elna said. I need my hens alive through February. The 4 that lived were under iron. The 8 that died were under canvas. Emrys set down the board he was holding. How large is the iron piece? 3 feet by 5 feet, roofing from a freight car. That is enough to cover a small coop if you build it low, but the iron must not touch the air. Pack earth and straw over the outside. Leave the bottom open to the ground so the hen's heat stays in and moisture drains down. Cut 1 small vent hole at the high end, no bigger than your fist, and block the windward side completely. Elna listened. She did not write it down. She repeated it back, detail for detail, the way a person does when they intend to remember. What about the iron sweating? She asked. Emrys looked at her. It was the right question. Not many people would ask it. Slope the iron so water runs to one end. Put straw at that end, thick, and change it when it soaks through. The hens will not sit where it drips if you give them a dry spot elsewhere. Elna nodded. She left without thanking him. 2 weeks later, Rusk reported that her 4 surviving hens were alive and laying, and that Elna had rigged the iron coop exactly as described. Jonas Ven's conversion was quieter and took longer. 3 days after the storm, Jonas came to the mound and asked to go inside. Emrys held the canvas flap. Jonas crouched and crawled through. He was inside for 10 minutes. When he came out, he sat on the earth berm and rubbed his hands on his knees. The iron is not cold, he said. The iron is not exposed, Emrys said. I have burned my fingers on iron and frozen my fingers on iron for 16 years. I did not think it could be neither. It is whatever the earth around it allows it to be. Protect it from wind, and it holds whatever heat it has. Expose it, and it matches the air in minutes. Jonas looked at the mound. He was working something through in his mind, and Emrys let him work. A man who changes his understanding on his own owns the new understanding. A man who is lectured into it resents the teacher. Finally, Jonas said, Lem Pike lost 2 fingers on the left hand and 3 on the right. He will not work freight again. I know. He was inside your shelter for 2 days. If he had stayed in his shanty, He would have lost his feet and maybe his life. I know that too. Jonas stood up. He held out the spokeshave. I said it was alone. Emrys took it. I know what you said. Jonas did not smile, but he extended his hand, and Emrys shook it. The handshake lasted 3 seconds. It was enough. Over the next 2 weeks, Jonas came back 4 times. Each time he asked a specific question. How thick should the earth be on the windward side versus the lee side? How did the drainage channel avoid freezing? What happened if the fire went out for 6 hours? Did the iron lose its heat immediately or hold it? Emrys answered each question with the same patience his father had used when teaching him to read a seam. By the end of November, Jonas had packed 6 inches of earth and sod against the windward wall of his own cabin. He reported to Emrys that his fuel consumption had dropped by 1/3. The community did not come to Emrys with admiration. They came because they were cold. A family named Stensland, father, mother, 4 children, had a sod house with walls thick enough on 3 sides but thin on the west, where the sod had settled and cracked. Wind drove through the cracks all night. The father asked Emrys what to do. Emrys walked to the house, examined the west wall, and told him to pack earth and brush against the outside, then cover the whole thing with sod strips cut from the collapsed section. Bank it like a hillside, not a wall. Stensland did. The wind stopped. A man named Grindheim had built a frame shanty with good boards but no chinking between them. He stuffed the cracks with rags and newspaper, but the wind tore them loose every night. Emrys told him to mix clay, ash, and chopped grass, the same mixture he had used inside the boiler, and press it into the cracks from the outside. Then pack earth over the clay so it did not dry and crumble. Grindheim did. His stove stopped screaming through the gaps. A school teacher named Agnes Flatten asked about vent placement. Her schoolhouse stove smoked badly when the wind came from the north. Emrys explained the principle: a low intake and a high exhaust, and the intake must be on the windward side so that wind pressure pushes air into the room instead of pulling it out. Agnes adjusted the vents. The stove drew cleanly for the first time since the building was raised. Each person who came received the same treatment. Emrys listened to the problem. He examined the structure. He gave specific, actionable instructions grounded in the same 3 principles: seal the air leaks, manage the water, and control the smoke. He did not charge. Martha insisted they accept food in return. A loaf of bread here, a jar of preserves there, a slab of salt pork from the Stenslands. But Emrys refused cash. Knowledge given is knowledge spread, he said to Martha. Knowledge sold is knowledge locked. Martha said, knowledge does not feed Nell. She was right, but the food kept coming, and by late November the Pritchards were eating better than they had since the railroad camp. Not well, but better. Martha's role in this was larger than Emrys admitted. She was the one who tracked the results. She kept a tally on a piece of board inside the lean-to: family name, problem, what was done, what happened after. The Stensland wall repair reduced their firewood use by nearly half. Martha knew this because Mrs. Stensland told her when she brought the salt pork. Grindheim's chinking held through 3 storms without needing repair. Agnes Flatten's schoolhouse had not smoked since the vent adjustment. Martha also taught the women what she had learned from 2 nights inside the cylinder: how to check bedding for dampness before dark, how to read a vent by holding a wet palm near it. Air moving meant the draft was working. Still air meant trouble. How to keep children below the smoke line if a fire misbehaved. These were not the same lessons Emrys gave. These were the lessons of a woman who had lain awake in the dark with a sick child on her chest and felt the smoke change direction. She taught them quietly, in the lean-to, while Emrys was out walking someone's wall. The women listened to Martha the way they did not always listen to Emrys, because Martha had been inside the barrel during the worst of it, and that was a credential no man could claim to share. Tallow watched all of this. He watched the way a man watches a fire he did not start moving toward his fence line. The Pritchards had not left. The claim was not abandoned. The quarter section remained filed. And now Emrys Pritchard, the man Tallow had dismissed as too poor for boards, was becoming useful. Useful men were difficult to displace. Useful men had neighbors who owed them favors. Useful men could not be quietly bought out when the first freeze made them desperate, because the first freeze had already come and they had survived it inside a rusted boiler that Tallow himself had called an iron coffin. Tallow's first move was legal. He rode to the land office and asked about the filing date on Emrys's quarter section. The filing was valid. The improvement, the boiler shelter, met the minimum dwelling requirement. Tallow asked whether a buried cylinder constituted a dwelling under the Homestead Act. The land office clerk, who had heard about the Pritchards from the telegraph operator, said he had seen worse dwellings accepted and that a family of 5 living inside it through a blizzard was proof enough of habitation. Tallow's second move was reputational. He told anyone who would listen that the boiler was railroad property. Emrys had stolen it from the scrap siding. The Northern Pacific would want it back. The family was squatting inside stolen goods. This was a weak argument, and Tallow knew it. The scrap siding was a dumping ground. The railroad had abandoned the boiler barrel along with everything else on the siding, but the accusation did not need to be true. It needed to make people hesitate before helping the Pritchards further. Rusk heard the accusation and rode to the siding foreman to ask. The foreman laughed. He said the railroad would pay someone to haul that junk away if anyone offered. Rusk told Tallow this publicly, at the freight platform, in front of Jonas and 3 other men. Tallow did not argue. He went quiet. Quiet in Cyrus Tallow was more dangerous than loud. Toluf Brecka came to the mound every 3rd or 4th day through November. He and Emrys worked together the way 2 men work who understand the same materials but learn them in different places. Toluf's knowledge was riverboat iron, large-scale boiler repair, heavy riveting, the behavior of pressurized vessels under stress. Emrys's knowledge was small shop forge work, patching, sealing, reading heat in metal by color and touch. Where they overlapped, they moved fast. Where they differed, they argued. The first project was the double-door flap. Toluf said a single canvas door was a single point of failure. Tear it, and the wind owns the interior. He showed Emrys how to rig a second layer. A blanket hung 6 inches inside the canvas, suspended from wire hooks driven into the barrel's rivet heads. The air gap between canvas and blanket acted as insulation. The 2 layers together stopped drafts that either one alone could not. Emrys tested the double door by holding a candle flame near the gap between the layers while Martha pushed against the canvas from outside. The flame did not flicker. The dead air between the 2 barriers was holding. Toluf said, "Still air is the best insulator a poor man has. Better than wool, better than straw, better than wood. The problem is keeping it still." The second project was condensation. As November deepened and the temperature difference between inside and outside grew, moisture from breath and cooking began to collect on the upper curve of the barrel. Drops formed on the iron, ran along the curve, and fell on the bedding. Martha woke one morning with ice crystals on the quilt, where condensation had frozen during the hours when the fire burned lowest. Toluf examined the problem. He said, "The iron is colder at the crown than at the sides because heat rises and pools there, but the earth is thinnest at the top. Add more earth to the crown, 3 more inches, and the iron temperature evens out. Where the temperature evens, the condensation spreads instead of pooling." Emrys piled more earth on the crown. Martha hung a strip of wool along the upper curve inside, a wick that caught condensation drops and channeled them toward the drainage sump instead of letting them fall on sleepers. The combination thicker insulation above, wool wick inside, reduced the dripping to almost nothing. These were small improvements. Each one by itself was trivial. Together they turned a survivable shelter into a livable one. The difference between surviving a winter and living through a winter was made of dozens of adjustments this small. Their first real disagreement came over the smoke vent. The original vent, the 6-inch hole Emrys had cut with Toluf's chisel, worked, but it leaked heat constantly. Warm air rose to the vent and carried heat out with the smoke. Toluf wanted to rivet a curved baffle beneath the vent opening, a half-moon of scrap iron that would deflect rising heat sideways while allowing smoke to curl up and over the baffle and out. The baffle would reduce heat loss without blocking the draft. Emrys said the baffle would collect soot and creosote, and in a space this small, any fire near the vent would be impossible to reach for cleaning. Tolliff said, "A baffle you clean once a week saves more heat than a clean hole that bleeds warmth day and night." Emrys said, "A baffle that catches fire at 3 in the morning in a sealed cylinder kills everyone inside." They stood on opposite sides of the mound, both right, both unwilling to move. Martha watched from the lean-to. She did not intervene. She had learned that two men who know iron must be left to finish their argument in iron, not in words. Tolliff came back 2 days later with a compromise. He had cut the baffle with 4 notches along the lower edge, gaps that would allow soot to fall through instead of accumulating. The notches were small enough to still deflect heat, but large enough to prevent dangerous buildup. He offered it to Emrys without explanation, just held it out. Emrys looked at the notches. He said, "You cut those this morning." "I cut those last night," Tolliff said, "after I thought about what you said about fire at 3 in the morning." They riveted the baffle together. The vent drew the same. The heat loss dropped. The first night after installation, the fire pan burned a quarter less fuel to hold the same temperature. In early December, Tolliff told Emrys something he had never told anyone in Dakota Territory. They were sitting inside the barrel, the only place warm enough for a conversation that did not involve shouting over wind, and Tolliff was examining the clay seals on the west end, checking for cracks that winter's freeze-thaw cycle might open. "I saw a boiler explode on the river," Tolliff said. He said it the way a man says something he has carried for a long time and sets down carefully. 1863. A stern-wheeler called the Northern Light between St. Paul and Winona. The boiler crown sheet burned dry. The explosion killed 2 men standing beside me. I felt the heat on my face and the iron passed me. An inch to the left and I would have been the third. Emrys was quiet. "That is why I feared this shell," Tolliff said. "Not because it is metal, because I know what metal can do when it is not respected. When I saw you chalking the seams, I thought, this man respects the iron. He does not trust it. He checks it." "My father taught me that," Emrys said. "Your father was wise. Trust in metal is how men die. Vigilance near metal is how men live." They sat in the barrel's dim warmth, 2 men who had learned iron from opposite ends of a continent, and the silence between them was the kind of silence that exists between people who understand the same danger. In late January, Tolliff walked through a blizzard to help a family named Haugen clear a blocked vent on their sod house. The Haugens had packed their windward wall with earth and brush, following Emrys's instructions, but the vent, a stovepipe running through the roof, had clogged with ice and snow. Smoke filled the house. 2 children were coughing. Tolliff cleared the vent. He showed the Haugens how to rig a cap over the pipe opening that kept snow out while allowing smoke to exit sideways. He stayed until the stove drew clean. On the walk home, the wind found him. He was 64 years old. He was 2 miles from his own cabin. The snow drove horizontal, and the temperature was well below zero, and the distance that had taken 40 minutes on the way out took 3 hours on the way back. He arrived at his cabin with ice in his beard and his chest making sounds that were not breathing. Pneumonia settled in his lungs within 2 days. It did not announce itself with drama. It arrived the way cold arrives through a crack, slowly, then completely. Tolliff coughed. Then he could not stop coughing. Then the cough turned wet. Then he could not rise from his cot. Emrys came every day. He brought broth made from beans and salt pork. He kept Tolliff's stove fed. He sat beside the cot and listened to Tolliff breathe, and the sound was like air moving through a cracked seam, a slow leak that no clay could seal. On the 5th day, Tolliff said, "Do not become the only man who knows. One man with knowledge is a locked door. If you die, the knowledge dies. Teach it. Give it away. Let 10 people carry it so that if 9 forget, 1 remembers." On the 7th day, Tolliff died. He died at midday, with the stove burning and the wind quiet outside, and the light coming through the cabin's one window in a white square that fell across the floor. Emrys was beside him. Tolliff's hands were on the blanket, those enormous scarred hands that had gripped boiler iron for 40 years. The hands went still first, then the breathing stopped. Emrys sat beside the body for an hour. He did not speak. He did not pray. He held Tollef's hand, which was already cooling, the way iron cools when it is no longer near a fire. And he thought about a forge in Wales, and a forge on a riverboat, and a drainage ditch on the Dakota prairie, where two men had lowered a rusted cylinder into the earth, because they both understood what metal could do when it was treated right. Outside, snow covered the land from horizon to horizon, and somewhere under it, an iron barrel held a family that a dead man had helped save. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it. February 1881, a month after Tollef's death. Emrys was repairing the lean-to cooking area when a boy on a mule came pounding across the snow. The schoolhouse stovepipe had collapsed. Not the vent that Agnes Flatten had adjusted in November, the main pipe, the one that ran from the cast-iron stove through the roof. Wind had loosened the roof collar during a storm the night before, and the pipe had shifted, cracked at a joint, and fallen inward during the morning's fire. Smoke filled the single room. Agnes had 23 children inside. She had opened the door and the windows, but the wind was blowing snow directly into the building, and the children could not leave without walking into a storm that had already closed the road. The boy said, "Mrs. Flatten says, can you come? She says you know about smoke." Emrys looked at the sky. The storm was not the worst he had seen. The wind was strong, but the snow was intermittent, and visibility held to 50 yards between gusts. He could make the walk. It was 1.25 miles to the schoolhouse. He told Martha. Martha said, "Tollef would have gone." Emrys put on his coat. He took a piece of scrap tin, a handful of clay mixture wrapped in oilcloth, and a length of wire. He walked into the storm. The schoolhouse was chaos organized by one calm woman. Agnes Flatten had moved the children to the far wall, away from the stove. She had wet rags from the water pail and held them over the faces of the youngest ones. Smoke hung from the ceiling to the height of a seated child's head, a gray-brown layer that rippled when the wind gusted through the cracks. The stovepipe lay on the floor in 2 pieces, the joint blackened and split. Smoke poured from the stove's open collar and spread across the ceiling like dark water. 3 children were crying. 2 were coughing too hard to cry. Agnes's voice cut through all of it, steady, firm, not loud, directing the older students to keep the younger ones low. A girl of about 12 was holding a wet rag over an infant's face, while the infant's brother, perhaps 6, gripped her sleeve and stared at the smoke with eyes that understood what he was seeing. Emrys did not look at the pipe. He looked at the room. Low intake, high exhaust, wind direction. He looked at the windows, 2 on the south wall, 1 on the north, all closed. He looked at the door, which was cracked open and admitting snow along with a thin stream of air that was doing nothing useful. He looked at the gap in the roof where the pipe had been, a dark hole the size of a dinner plate, currently acting as both an intake for wind-driven snow and a weak exhaust for the smoke that reached it. "Close the door," he said. "Close every window except the one on the north wall." Agnes said, "The north window faces the wind." "I know. Open it 2 inches, not more. The wind will push air into the room at floor level. Smoke rises. It needs somewhere to go up and out. The roof hole where the pipe was, that is the exhaust. Wind pushes in through the north window, pushes the warm, smoky air upward, and the smoke goes out through the roof." Agnes did not argue. She had seen Emrys work before. She opened the north window 2 inches. Cold air hit the children, and the youngest ones cried louder, but the smoke began to move. It shifted like a living thing, curling away from the incoming cold air, sliding along the ceiling toward the roof hole. It thinned near the floor first. The children could breathe. Then at face height, the adults could see. Then at the ceiling, where it narrowed from a solid layer to streams that twisted and funneled upward through the hole. Within 5 minutes, the air was breathable. Within 10, the room smelled of cold and wet wool instead of smoke. Emrys climbed onto a bench and packed wet clay around the roof hole to narrow it, not seal it, narrow it. so the exhaust pulled steadily instead of gusting. He wired the scrap tin over the outside of the hole at an angle, creating a cap that kept snow out while allowing smoke to escape sideways. It was the same rig Tollef had built for the Haugans. The same rig Tollef had walked 2 miles through a blizzard to install. The stovepipe could be reassembled, but not during the storm. For now, the room functioned as a crude version of the same system that kept the boiler shelter alive. Small intake, controlled exhaust, air moving in the right direction. Agnes said, "How did you know to do that?" Emrys said, "A man who is not here anymore taught me. He said air moves the way water moves. It goes where you give it a path. If you give it no path, it goes where it wants, and where it wants is usually wrong." He stayed until the storm passed. The children warmed. The stove burned without smoke reaching the floor. Agnes Flayton watched Emrys check the vent 3 times in 2 hours, adjusting the tin cap each time the wind shifted, and she understood that what she was watching was not improvisation. It was practice. It was knowledge tested in an iron barrel during the worst night of the worst storm, and it worked in a schoolhouse the same way it worked in a cylinder because the principles were the same. When Emrys left, Agnes said, "I will teach my students what you showed me." "Teach them what Tollef Brecka showed me," Emrys said. "Use his name." Tallow made his move in late February. He had spent the winter watching Emrys's reputation grow, the way a man watches a crack spread through a wall. Each family Emrys helped was a family that owed Emrys gratitude instead of owing Tallow money. Each vent adjusted, each wall banked, each shelter improved was proof that Tallow had been wrong about the iron coffin, and Tallow could not afford to be wrong publicly because public wrongness eroded the authority that made people sell him their claims at a loss. So Tallow did what men like Tallow do. He stole the idea and stripped out the parts that kept people alive. He acquired 3 culvert pipes from a railroad scrap shipment, shorter than Emrys's boiler barrel but similar in shape. He sold them to desperate families as Pritchard patent winter tubes, charging $8 apiece, which was more than most homesteaders had to spare. The tubes came with no instructions about venting, no guidance on sealing, no warning about condensation or draft reversal, or the difference between a buried cylinder and a bare one. Emrys learned about it from Jonas Venn, who had seen one of the tubes sitting above ground behind a shanty near the freight road. No earth covering, no insulation. One open end stuffed with straw, a fire burning inside on bare iron. "It is a chimney lying on its side," Jonas said. "The iron is freezing on the outside and smoking on the inside. A family is sleeping in it." Emrys went to look. What he found was worse than Jonas had described. The family, a young couple named Solheim, had crawled into the tube because Tallow had told them it would keep them warm the way Pritchard's shelter kept his family warm. The tube was bare. Wind hit the exposed iron and pulled heat through the walls faster than the fire could replace it. Smoke had nowhere to go because there was no vent. The straw stuffing at the open end was damp, smoldering, and producing more smoke than the fire itself. The wife's eyes were red and swollen. The husband was coughing blood. Emrys pulled them out. He walked them to the Stensland's sod house, where Stensland's wife fed them broth and put them near the stove. Then Emrys went to find Tallow. He found him at the freight platform. 3 men were present, Jonas, Rusk, and a railroad clerk. Emrys did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "The Solheims nearly died," Emrys said. "Smoke and cold. No vent. No insulation. Bare iron in the wind. You sold them a pipe and called it by my method." Tallow said, "I sold them a shelter. What they did with it is their concern." "You sold them a pipe without telling them it would kill them. The method works because of the earth, the ceiling, the vents, and the drainage. Without those, a metal tube is a death trap. You know this because you heard Rusk say it. You heard Jonas say it. You watched me seal the seams and cut the vents and pack the earth. You sold the part that kills and left out the part that saves." Tallow's face did not change. He said, "You gave the knowledge away. I made it worth something. You made it worth $8 and 2 lives." Rusk stepped forward. He did not touch Tallow. He said, "Cyrus, If those people had died inside that pipe, this conversation would be happening in front of a sheriff instead of a freight platform. Do not sell another one. Tallow looked at Rusk, at Jonas, at the clerk. He was calculating. 3 witnesses. One of them a former Army teamster with standing in the community. One of them a freight handler who could spread the story along the rail line. One of them a railroad employee who could write a letter. Tallow said nothing. He left. But the tubes were already sold. 2 more families had them. Emrys spent the next 3 days visiting each one, showing them how to trench, bank, seal, vent, and drain. He did this in the cold, walking miles between claims, and each time he arrived at a bare pipe sitting on frozen ground, he felt the same anger, not at the families who were doing what they had been told would work, but at the man who had sold survival and delivered a weapon. The tubes, once properly installed, worked, not as well as the boiler barrel. They were smaller, thinner, and less suited to the purpose, but they held heat when buried and vented, and the families inside them survived the rest of the winter. Emrys did not charge for the instruction. Tollef's voice was in his head every step of the way. Do not become the only man who knows. Spring came the way it always comes to the northern plains, not as warmth, but as the absence of the worst cold. The snow did not melt so much as surrender, pulling back from the south-facing slopes first, then from the flats, then from the north-facing hollows where it had packed itself deep and dense. By April of 1881, the prairie was brown and wet and smelled of thawing earth, and the boiler mound stood in the middle of it like a thing that had been there forever. The barrel was no longer the family's only shelter. Emrys had spent the last weeks of winter cutting sod and stacking it into walls at the east end of the mound, building a small room 8 feet by 10 feet, the minimum the Homestead Act required, that attached to the barrel's canvas door like a box joined to a tube. The sod room had a proper door frame made from salvaged freight lumber. It had a window, a single pane, cracked at one corner, that Jonas Venn had pulled from a wrecked boxcar and carried to the claim without being asked. It had a plank floor raised 4 inches above the mud on cinder blocks. The barrel remained behind the sod room, connected by a low crawl, through that Emrys sealed with a double curtain of canvas and wool. It was no longer the family's home. It was their storm cellar, their fever room, their emergency warming chamber, the protected core that the sod room could not match when the worst weather returned. Martha had organized the sod room the way she organized everything, with precision that made small spaces feel larger than they were. The stove, a proper cast-iron stove that Rusk had found at a foreclosure sale and sold to Emrys for 50 cents, and a promise to inspect Rusk's cabin vents before the next winter, sat in the northeast corner. The children's sleeping shelf ran along the south wall. Martha and Emrys slept on a pallet near the stove. The table was a plank on 2 barrel hoops, and it held a lamp, the water pail, and Martha's tally board, which now listed 14 families and their improvements. 14 families, in one winter, from one rusted cylinder in a drainage ditch. The teaching had become a rhythm by spring. Emrys did not hold classes or make speeches. He walked. He walked to a family's claim and looked at their shelter the way Tollef had looked at the boiler, studying the iron, reading the seams, finding the places where heat escaped and cold entered and water collected. Then he told them what to do, specific, measurable, grounded in the 3 principles that governed every structure he touched: seal the air, manage the water, control the smoke. But the teaching had changed since Tollef's death. Emrys no longer taught alone. He brought people with him. The first was Jonas Venn. Jonas had banked his own cabin walls successfully, and he understood the logic well enough to explain it to someone else. Emrys sent Jonas to help Grindheim's neighbor, a man named Espeland, who had a frame shanty with gaps wide enough to see daylight through. Jonas mixed the clay and ash compound, showed Espeland how to press it into the cracks from the outside, and stayed until the first coat dried. He came back to Emrys and reported what he had done. Emrys asked 2 questions. Did you check the vent? Did you check the drainage? Jonas had checked both. The teaching was transferring. The second was Agnes Flatten. After the schoolhouse crisis, Agnes had understood the ventilation principles well enough to teach them to her students. She made it part of the school day, 15 minutes each Monday morning spent on what she called the three enemies: air, water, smoke. She drew diagrams on the chalkboard. She quizzed the children. She made the oldest students explain the principles to the youngest, because explaining was how understanding solidified. By spring, 23 children could describe how a vent worked, why insulation mattered, and what to do if smoke reversed in a sealed room. The third was Martha. Martha did not walk to claims. She received women at the lean-to and later at the sod room, and she taught what Emrys could not: the daily management of a shelter through a winter, how to feel a vent with a wet palm, how to check bedding for dampness before dark, because damp bedding at dusk became frozen bedding by midnight, how to read the sound of a stove. A clean draw hummed, a block draw muttered, a reverse draw went silent, which was the most dangerous sound of all. How to keep a child warm when the fuel ran low, skin to skin, wool over both, the child's back against the warmest wall. These were not lessons from books. These were lessons from 2 nights inside an iron cylinder with a sick child and a stranger with dead fingers, and every woman who heard them knew they were hearing something that could not be learned any other way. Tallow's end came not with a confrontation, but with a collapse. In late March, the weight of a winter's worth of snow and meltwater broke the roof of Tallow's storehouse, not the section that had failed during the October blizzard, that had been patched, but the main beam, which had been weakened by the earlier damage and by Tallow's attempt to berm the walls with earth in imitation of what he had seen Emrys do. Tallow had understood the surface of the method: earth against walls. He had not understood the structure. He had piled earth against a wall that was not braced for lateral pressure. He had not accounted for the water that earth holds when snow melts. He had not sloped the berming to drain. The earth had become a sponge. The sponge had become a weight, and the weight had pushed inward against the storehouse wall until the main beam cracked and the roof came down. 40 sacks of flour, the replacements for the 40 lost in October wires, were soaked and ruined. Feed grain worth more than $60 turned to paste. The storehouse, which was the foundation of Tallow's business, was a pile of broken wood and wet earth. Worse, one of the culvert pipes Tallow had sold, the one he had kept on his own property for hired men, had shifted when the berming collapsed. The earth that should have insulated it instead fell against the vent opening and sealed it. 2 hired men sleeping inside woke to smoke so thick they could not find the door. They crawled out by following the curve of the iron downward to the ground, and then along the ground to the opening. One of them, a young man named Pruitt, had burns on both hands from pressing against the iron near the fire pan, where the metal was hot enough to blister. Rusk heard about it within a day. He rode to Tallow's property, looked at the collapsed storehouse, looked at the pipe with its blocked vent and scorched interior, and then rode to Emrys's claim. "Come with me," Rusk said. Emrys did not want to go. He had said what he needed to say to Tallow at the freight platform in February. But Rusk said, "This is not about what you want. This is about what the community needs to see." They rode to the freight platform, where Rusk had gathered Jonas, Agnes, the Stensland father, and 4 other claim holders. Tallow was there, standing beside his horse with his hat in his hands. He looked smaller than Emrys remembered. The winter had taken weight from him, and the storehouse collapse had taken something else, the certainty that had always made Tallow's voice fill a room. Rusk did not raise his voice. He said, "Cyrus, you sold shelters that nearly killed 2 men this week. You sold the same kind of shelters in February that nearly killed the Solheims. You bermed your own storehouse without drainage or bracing and lost your roof and your flour. Every piece of this damage came from taking a method you did not understand and selling it without the knowledge that makes it safe." Tallow said nothing. Rusk continued. Emrys Pritchard gave the knowledge away. He walked to every family that needed it. He did not charge. He did not profit. You charged $8 a pipe and left out the instructions that keep people alive. You owe these people an accounting. Tallow looked at Emrys. There was no anger left in his face. There was something worse than anger, the look of a man who understood too late that he had been wrong about which kind of strength mattered. "I will pay for the damage," Tallow said. His voice was flat. You will pay for the damage, Rusk agreed. And you will not sell another pipe or another shelter or another piece of advice about wintering until you can explain the three principles to me the way a child could understand them: air, water, smoke. When you can do that, you can sell what you like. Tallow put his hat on. He mounted his horse. He rode east toward his broken storehouse. He did not become kind. He did not apologize to Emrys. He did not shake anyone's hand. But he stopped selling. And over the following year, Emrys heard from Jonas that Tallow had quietly banked his rebuilt storehouse walls with proper drainage, proper bracing, an event that Tallow had cut himself using the dimensions Emrys had described at the freight platform confrontation. Tallow never said Emrys's name when he described the method to others, but he used it, and using it was enough. The second winter was easier, not easy. Winter on the northern Dakota plains was never easy. But the Pritchards entered it with a sod room, a proper stove, a full cord of scrap wood supplemented by buffalo chips and twisted grass, and the boiler shelter waiting behind the sod wall like a fist inside a glove. The difference between the first winter and the second was the difference between surviving and living. The first winter, every hour had been a calculation. Fuel against cold, air against smoke, water against bedding. The second winter, the calculations were still there, but they ran beneath the surface, the way a river runs beneath ice. Martha checked the vent every evening before the children slept. She pressed her wet palm near the opening and felt the air move, and if it moved, she said nothing. If it did not move, she said, "Emrys," one word. And Emrys checked the vent collar outside, cleared whatever snow or ice had narrowed the opening, and came back inside. The routine took 3 minutes. It replaced the panic of the first year with a discipline that was quieter and more powerful. The barrel served its purpose 3 times that winter. The first was during a January blizzard that lasted 4 days. The sod room's stovepipe iced over on the second night, a collar of frozen condensation that narrowed the pipe until the draw choked and smoke backed into the room. Emrys could not clear the pipe from inside without dismantling it, and dismantling a stovepipe during a blizzard meant losing the stove for hours. Instead, he moved the family through the crawl-through into the barrel, lit the fire pan, and sealed the curtain behind them. They spent 14 hours in the cylinder while the storm raged. When the wind dropped enough for Emrys to climb onto the sod roof and clear the pipe with a heated rod, the family moved back to the sod room. The transition took 20 minutes. No one panicked. Gwen helped Nell through the crawl-through. Tomos carried the water pail. Martha carried the lamp. The second time was in February, when Nell developed a croup so deep that her breathing sounded like a saw cutting wet wood. Martha needed warmth and moisture, not the dry heat of the sod room stove, but the close, humid air of a small, sealed space. She hung wet cloths from the rivet heads inside the barrel and let the fire pan's warmth turn them to steam. Nell lay on the lower pallet with her face near the damp cloth, breathing air that was warm and wet, and by morning the croup had loosened enough that she could swallow water without coughing it back. The third time was when the Haugen family arrived at the Pritchards' door at midnight. The Haugans, the same family Tollef had helped the night he walked through the blizzard, had a sod house with banked walls and a working vent, but their stove had cracked along a seam and poured smoke into the room faster than the vent could carry it out. The father had frostbitten feet from standing outside in the snow trying to seal the stove crack with wet clay that froze before it set. The mother was carrying an infant. 2 older children stood behind her, silent and shivering. Emrys put the Haugans in the barrel. He put his own family in the sod room. The Haugans stayed for 2 days while the father's feet healed enough to walk, and Emrys helped him patch the stove with a riveted iron plate cut from the scrap pile at the siding. Each time, the barrel held. Each time, the principles proved themselves again. The sealed air, the managed water, the controlled smoke, the earth keeping the wind from stealing what the fire gave. Martha kept her tally board. By the end of the second winter, 22 families had received instruction. 8 had banked their walls. 3 had built small, bermed shelters, not boiler barrels, but adapted versions using freight crates, old wagon beds, and culvert sections, all properly vented and drained.
The method was spreading not as a single design, but as a set of rules that could be applied to whatever materials a family had. Emrys and Martha worked as partners in a way that the community could see. He diagnosed the structure. She diagnosed the living. He told a family how to seal their walls. She told them how to check whether the ceiling was working. He walked to claims in the cold and came back late. She tracked the results and noticed patterns he missed. Families that banked their windward walls but forgot the foundation, lost heat through the frozen ground. Women who checked vents at dusk but not at midnight found them blocked by the ice that formed in the coldest hours. Martha began visiting claims herself in the second winter. Not to diagnose walls, that was Emrys's work. She visited to see how families were living inside the shelters, because a shelter that was sealed and vented could still fail if the family inside did not manage it. She found a woman who had blocked her low intake with a rag because she thought the cold air entering through it was the problem. Martha explained that the cold intake was the solution. Without it, smoke had nowhere to go. She found a family that had packed their bedding against the iron wall of a bermed freight crate, and the bedding was soaked with condensation every morning. Martha showed them how to keep bedding 6 inches away from metal using willow slats the way Emrys had inside the boiler. She came home from these visits tired and quiet, and sometimes she sat at the table and added notes to the tally board. Not numbers, but observations. Moen family intake blocked, showed wife the draft test, husband not convinced. Solheim, bedding against iron, fixed, showed slat method. The tally board grew until it covered both sides, and Martha started a second one. Their marriage had been tested the way iron is tested, by pressure and heat and cold, and it had held the way iron holds when it is properly protected. Not because it was strong in the way people mean when they say strong, because it was sealed. The leaks had been found and filled. The drafts had been stopped. What remained was warmth that did not escape. The years compressed the way years do when the worst is past. By 1882, Emrys had earned enough from freight labor, loading and unloading at the siding he had once scavenged from Sar, to buy a horse. It was a short-backed mare with a Roman nose and a temperament that matched Martha's, patient with work, impatient with nonsense. The horse let Emrys reach claims he had previously walked to in 3 hours in less than 1. The radius of his teaching doubled, and with it the number of families who applied the principles before their first winter. Rusk, who had quietly become the settlement's unofficial arbiter of disputes and standards, began sending new arrivals to Emrys before they broke ground. "See Pritchard before you set your stove" became a phrase that railroad clerks repeated to homesteaders collecting their baggage at the Jamestown depot. It was not a rule. It was advice from men who had seen what happened when shelters were built without attention to the 3 enemies. Emrys resisted the role at first. He was not a builder. He was not an engineer. He was a boiler patcher's son who had buried a cylinder in a ditch because he had no lumber and no money and no time. But the resistance faded as the evidence accumulated. Every family he visited that followed the principles lost less fuel, lost fewer animals, and lost no children. Every family that did not, that built with gaps or blocked their vents, or let water pool against their foundations, suffered in proportion to what they ignored. The evidence was Martha's tally board. By the spring of 1883, the board had been replaced by a ledger, a proper bound book that Martha had received from Agnes Flatton, who had received it from a stationer in Fargo. Martha recorded every visit, every recommendation, and every outcome. The ledger was not science. It was observation, kept in a neat hand, organized by family name and date. But it told a story that no single visit could. The families that sealed and vented and drained survived the winters in better condition than those that did not, and the margin was not small. It was the difference between a family that arrived at spring with healthy children and full bedding and a family that arrived at spring with sick children and frozen quilts and a woodpile so depleted they had burned their furniture in February. By 1883, Gwen Pritchard was 13 and had earned a reputation for checking schoolhouse vents before storms. Agnes Flatton called her the inspector and let Gwen teach the younger children the vent drill. Gwen did it the way her mother did everything, quietly, precisely, without wasted motion. She could identify a blocked vent by the sound of the room, a faint change in pressure that most adults could not hear, but that Gwen had learned to detect during 2 nights inside the boiler, when every sound meant something. Tomos, who had nearly died of fever inside the barrel on the worst night, grew into a boy with steady hands and a fascination with machines. He apprenticed with a machinist in Jamestown at 15. He told the machinist about the boiler shelter, and the machinist said it sounded like nonsense until Tomos explained the physics, the thermal mass, the insulation, the air management, in language that a man who worked with metal every day could respect. The machinist said, "Your father is either very clever or very lucky." Tomos said, "He is very tired. Clever men who work that hard usually are." Nell was the youngest and remembered the least, but what she remembered was specific. She called the barrel the warm tunnel. She remembered the sound of wind outside the iron, a low humming that was different from wind against wood or canvas, a sound that meant the metal was taking the blow and not passing it through. She remembered Martha singing in Welsh. She remembered Tolef's hands, which she had touched once and found rough as tree bark. Years later, when she was grown and had children of her own, she would press her palm against a cold wall and then against a warm one and tell her children, "One gives slowly, one steals quickly." She did not know she was quoting Emerson's father. She thought the words were her own, which meant they had become what all good teaching becomes, invisible, woven into the person, indistinguishable from thought. By 1884, the Pritchards had a proper sod house with a frame front, a plank floor, glass windows, and a stove that drew cleanly because Emrys had built the chimney himself using every principle Tolef had taught him about draft. The house was not large. It was not fine, but it was tight and warm, and it did not leak heat or air or water in any direction that Emrys had not chosen. Behind the house, barely visible beneath 4 years of prairie grass, the boiler mound remained. The iron was hidden now, a rusted spine under a blanket of sod and earth that had become part of the landscape. The vent collar, blackened and patched with a riveted ring that Tolef and Emrys had fitted together in November of 1880, still rose from the top of the mound. Grass grew around its base. A meadowlark nested in the lee of it one spring, tucked against the warm iron the way the Pritchard children had once tucked against the warm curve inside. The barrel was no longer used for shelter. It was used for storage, for root keeping, for the kind of purposes that do not require explanation. But Emrys never sealed the vent. He never filled the drainage channel. He never removed the willow slats from the sleeping shelves. The shelter was always one storm away from being needed again, and Emrys treated it the way Tolef had taught him to treat iron, with vigilance, not trust. Emrys Pritchard was not called to many emergencies after the third winter, not because the emergencies stopped, but because other people knew what to do. Jonas Venn could diagnose a vent problem and fix it in an afternoon. Agnes Flatten could direct a smoke evacuation with the calm authority of someone who had done it twice and practiced it 50 times. Stensland could bank a wall and explain the drainage to a neighbor. Martha could teach a woman to read her shelter's health by touch and sound and smell. The knowledge had multiplied the way Tolef had wanted it to, carried by many hands instead of locked behind one door. Rusk died in the winter of 1885 of a heart that stopped while he was splitting wood. He fell beside the chopping block and was found by his hired hand within the hour, but the cold had already taken him. At the burial, Jonas said that Rusk had been the first man to leave oxen for a stranger, and the last man to admit he had done it. Emrys said nothing at the burial. He went home and checked the vent collar on the boiler mound, which did not need checking, and sat beside it in the cold until Martha came out and brought him inside. But there were still moments when someone came to Emrys. A new family would arrive on the rail line, Germans from Minnesota, Norwegians from Wisconsin, Americans from Ohio, and they would file on a quarter section and begin building a soddy or a shanty, and someone would say, "Talk to Pritchard before you set your stove." And Emrys would walk to the claim and look at the walls and the roof and the vent and the drainage, and he would say what needed saying in the fewest words that would carry the meaning. He never lectured. He showed. He put his hand on the wall and asked the new settler to feel the cold coming through,
He held a candle near the vent and showed how the flame told the truth about the draft. He poured a cup of water on the floor and watched where it ran, and he said, "Water tells you where your problems are. Follow the water." He was not wealthy. He was not famous beyond the claims within a day's ride of the rail line. He was the man people called when a stove smoked, a roof sweated, or a winter wall leaked heat faster than a family could make it. He charged nothing. He accepted food. He walked home in the cold and sat in the sod house with Martha and ate whatever she had made and said little because the work spoke and the man did not need to. In the autumn of 1887, Emrys took his grandson, Gwen's first child, a boy of 2 hours, to the old mound behind the house. The mound was low and grassed over. A person who did not know what lay beneath it would see nothing but a rise in the ground, a slight hump in the prairie that could have been a buried boulder or an old root cellar. The vent collar was the only sign. It stood 6 inches above the grass, blackened iron with a riveted patch, and it cast a small shadow in the afternoon light. Emrys lifted the boy and set him on the grass beside the mound. He took the boy's hand and placed it on the vent collar. The iron was cool in the shade, cool the way iron is cool when the air touches it freely. The boy pulled his hand back and looked at his grandfather. Emrys knelt. He scraped away a handful of earth from the mound's south side, exposing a curved section of the barrel wall where the earth had protected it for 7 years. He placed the boy's hand on the exposed iron. The boy held his hand there. The iron was not cool. It was not warm either. Not the way it had been during the winters when a fire burned inside and bodies pressed against the shelves. But it was different from the vent collar. It was the temperature of the earth around it, not the temperature of the air above it. It was held. The boy did not understand what he was feeling. He was 2 years old. But his hand stayed on the iron, and Emrys watched him the way his own father had watched him in a Welsh forge when a boy's palm learned the difference between metal that steels and metal that holds. Emrys covered the iron with earth again. He picked up his grandson and walked back to the house, where Martha was boiling water for tea and the autumn light came through the glass windows in long gold bars that lay across the plank floor. Behind them, the mound sat in the grass the way it had always sat, quiet, low, unremarkable. The vent collar caught the last of the light. The earth held the iron. The iron held the shape of the room where, 7 years before, a family had lain in the dark while the worst storm in a decade tried to get in and failed. Within 2 winters of October 1880, at least a dozen families near the Northern Pacific Line west of Jamestown used some part of what Emrys Pritchard had proved inside a rusted locomotive boiler. Not the barrel itself. No one replicated that because no one else had a 15-foot cylinder lying in a drainage ditch. They used the rules. They banked sod against windward walls and watched their fuel last longer. They built smaller sleeping chambers inside drafty shelters and kept their children warm through nights that froze water in an open pail. They checked vents before storms. They followed the water. They sealed the air. They managed the smoke. And they did these things because a Welsh boiler patcher with $3.80 had refused to leave a quarter section that a feed store owner wanted to buy for nothing. Emrys Pritchard lived the rest of his life within sight of the rail line that had expelled him. He never rode the train as a passenger. He walked, or he rode a horse he bought in 1882 with money earned from freight labor, not from selling knowledge. He died in 1903, at 59, in the sod house with the frame front and the glass windows and the stove that drew cleanly because he had built the chimney himself. Martha was beside him. Nell, who was 27 by then, held his hand. The hand was scarred across both palms from a week in October when he had gripped fence posts and iron wedges until the skin tore open and the scars had never fully smoothed. They called it an iron coffin. Cyrus Tallow said it at the freight platform, while men laughed and Martha held a sick child, and the first frost silvered the tent ropes at the grading camp west of Jamestown. He is burying his children in an iron coffin. The words carried across the settlement the way wind carries smoke, into every ear, through every conversation, past every doubt that Emrys himself held in the dark hours when he lay awake and wondered whether cleverness had become pride.
But in October of 1880, when the blizzard buried the prairie and the flat-roofed shanties lost their walls and the canvas tents collapsed, and Alva Rusk burned through a quarter of his woodpile in a single night, a rusted locomotive barrel sat half-buried in a drainage ditch with earth on its back, and a thin line of smoke rising from a 6-inch vent, and inside it 5 people breathed, and a 6th man with frozen fingers found warmth he had mocked that morning, and a cup of water hung from a wire hook and did not freeze. And under the prairie grass, years later and years after that, the old iron still held the shape of the room where winter tried to get in and failed.